Thank you for joining us today. We are in the midst of an epidemic of nicotine use amongst American teenagers, which is reversing decades of public health gains. It is widely acknowledged that JUUL, with its unprecedentedly high nicotine levels and sweet and fruity flavors, has been the principal driver of the resurgence of youth nicotine addiction to levels not seen in many years. My purpose in this presentation is to analyze the role the company played in promoting JUUL as it became a viral brand amongst teens, exploring the actions the company took as the product achieved a cult-like status and thereby saturated American middle and high schools with sweet-smelling vapor. We shall discuss the factors which drove JUUL to become a fad amongst American youth, including the device's design, its flavors, and its nicotine chemistry. Importantly, we shall explore the role of JUUL's marketing, particularly its use of social media, influencers, and celebrities in attracting a youthful following. The fundamental question we shall seek to clarify can be summarized simply. What did the company know? When did they know it? And once it became clear that underage teens were major consumers of their product, what measures did they take to counter the youth uptake? Now, being a physician, I have to say I have no disclosures. I don't think any tobacco company particularly would want to fund my research, but they've certainly never offered and I would never have accepted. Now, just a little background on what we call Stanford research into the impact of tobacco advertising, or SRITA. We maintain a database, and you can see looking across the top, it has things like cigarettes, pod e-cigarettes, heat not burn products, chewing tobacco, etc. And you're very welcome to visit this, and it's become a collection which has been very useful to people who study advertising and also people who create advertising. We have about 55,000 images, and if Cindy's here tonight, I want to thank her, who's our database manager. But we're focused tonight on pod e-cigarette devices, a relatively new category, and we have some 4,700 devices of that type in our database. The database, our SRITA database, has had 637,000 unique users as of recently, and that's in virtually every country in the world that uses this as a reference. Now, just as an aside, Lori and I created a museum exhibit. Having worked with the Smithsonian Institution for many years, all of the original tobacco ads we acquired, we gave to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian doesn't take much. We were very pleased, and they've been wonderful partners for us. And we just launched one historically. It's in the National Museum of American History, and it's on the theme of doctors, dentists, and nurses and tobacco advertising. And it's designed so that a family can come into the exhibit and begin sharing with their children about being skeptical about advertising and understanding how advertising can go wrong. So it actually dissects an ad and explains how it was formed in that way. Now, we've had an internship program for a number of years, and I want to particularly call out our 2018 internship group, who really did a lot of the social media work. These are mostly Stanford students who come to us for a few months over the summer, and these guys are social media mavens. You know, I'm too old to really understand social media well, but these guys are just terrific at it. Now, just by way of introduction, when we talk about electronic cigarettes, they began with what we call cigalikes, little sticks that were about the size and shape of cigarettes. Then it graduated to vape pens. Today, what you mostly have are advanced personal vaporizers that have a tank that you pour in the nicotine liquid. And of course, pod devices, which have become so viral. And also, as we're going to talk briefly at the end, about a new category you may not have heard of, called heat not burn devices, which is you're going to hear a lot about. Now, if you want to start a major tobacco company and have $1 billion, you probably can't do it. But if you want to start an e-cigarette company today, because there's no regulation, if you have $10,000, you call the folks in China, you give them their artwork, and they're going to ship you. This isn't actually a Stanford University e-cigarette, it's a Photoshop one, but there are very few barriers to the market, and that is why there are many hundreds of small startup electronic cigarette companies. Now, the vaping enthusiasm amongst young people is such that last weekend's game, the Stanford band spelled out vape on the field. So that enthusiasm extends to our Stanford undergraduates. Now, many of you here may realize that JUUL began at this very university. James Monsees and Adam Bowen were master's students in the design school. They looked to disrupt the tobacco industry by creating sort of an iPhone of e-cigarettes. Now, actually, Adam and James produced 3 different products. Their initial product was called Plume. It was actually a heat-not-burn device that was based upon Nespresso. The idea you have a little cartridge of shredded tobacco that you heat and have an aerosol, and actually they sold it to Japan Tobacco in 2013. Pax is a dry herb vaporizer. They sell the device, not the marijuana, but it's almost entirely used for marijuana. JUUL was launched in July 2015, a little over 4 years ago now, and has been an absolute phenomenon on the market. Now, like many startups, JUUL began with a very bright promise of helping humanity. It was to improve the lives of the world's 1 billion adult smokers by eliminating cigarettes. And JUUL was very proud to say it is not big tobacco, it is this good disruptive force to obsolete big tobacco through technology. In fact, later, as they say over and over again, they do not want teens or other non-smokers to use their product, even though it may well be the dominant users of their product. Now, I'm going to do something a little unconventional. I'm going to start at the end. I'm going to start with a 5-minute segment, which I gave in testimony to Congress a couple of months ago, and it summarizes the overview. And then I'm going to go through the evidence that backs up the opinions that I gave to show you the behavior of the company over the years. Now, when you go to Congress as an expert, you have 5 minutes at the start, and then there's a dialogue back and forth from the members on either side of the aisle. So we'll begin with this brief segment. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before your subcommittee today. Almost all smoking begins during adolescence. It's part of teen rebellion, typically commencing between the ages of 12 and 19. It would indeed be a very rare 40-year-old who woke up and said, "Hey, I think I'll start smoking today." And once a teen becomes hooked on nicotine, it's exceedingly difficult to quit. Many are stuck with a lifelong addiction. Now, from the beginning, JUUL professed a noble mission of improving the lives of 1 billion smokers. Instead, they have spurred an epidemic of nicotine addiction amongst youth. So how did JUUL stray so far from its stated mission? As a majority of smokers in America are ages 30 to 60, JUUL should have designed their advertising to connect to a middle-age audience. Over the first year, could we have the slides, please, Garrett? Garrett's a Harvard law student. I didn't know that. I thought it was over the first year, after JUUL launched in June 2015, it held at least a series of 50 highly stylized parties with youth-oriented entertainment in cities across America. Thousands of young people were given free JUULs, often by attractive young girls. JUUL's initial campaign, called Vaporized, was designed by an advertising agency whose goal it was to create a cult-like following, and they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Vaporized featured models in their 20s, in trendy-appearing poses and exhibiting behaviors more typical of underage teens than mature adults. Now, tobacco advertisers have long known that these imageries are exactly how to target underage kids. Just last week, in a televised documentary on CNBC, JUUL co-founder Adam Bowen claimed that the 2015 Vaporized campaign only lasted less than 6 months. It was lifestyle-oriented and, quote, had no impact upon sales. Lifestyle-oriented, it was obviously, if we could see the images, it's obviously youth-oriented in that way. Now, contradicting Mr. Bowen, JUUL's co-founder, James Monsees, a mere 7 months after JUUL launched, bragged, "Now we're actually the fastest growing e-cigarette company in the world." So today they say their early advertising, which was patently youth-oriented, made no difference. But in fact, at the time, they were bragging they were the most rapid growing in the world. This is either revisionist history or intentional deception. I'll let you be the judge. From its inception, JUUL mostly advertised on social media, especially Instagram, which skews heavily towards youth. JUUL paid influencers who are social media stars with a large number of online followers to praise JUUL. JUUL multiplied its reach by the use of hashtags, which which became online gathering places for teenagers. Under intense regulatory pressure, JUUL halted its own social media postings in November 2018. However, this was a hollow gesture. It didn't matter much, and the reason was that viral peer-to-peer promotion amongst teens assured a massive visibility of their products on an ongoing basis. For example, after JUUL quit its own postings last November, community posts and hashtag JUUL by kids surged, tripled. Now there's 540,000 posts and millions of views of that youthful material. JUUL leadership claims we were completely surprised by the youth usage of the product. Co-founder James Monsies brags, "We are the most educated company, the most diligent, the most well-researched." They are indeed a data-driven company. They know their market, to whom their products are distributed, and the identity of their customers. The New York Times interviewed a former JUUL manager who disclosed that JUUL knew that their products were becoming popular amongst underage users within the first few months on the market. So JUUL professes to be a technology which disrupts big tobacco. Like many tech startups, as the money starts rolling in, JUUL made many compromises to their grand vision. What should have become an off-ramp for adult smokers instead has become a heavily traveled on-ramp to nicotine addiction amongst teens, many of whom graduate to traditional combustible cigarettes. From a policy point of view, the best way to eliminate adult smoking is to keep teens from starting in the first place. So JUUL's recent partnership with SRITA combines the leading youth initiation cigarette, Marlboro, with the leading youth initiation e-cigarette, JUUL. That their agreement specifies joint JUUL-Marlboro marketing is of great concern. So JUUL has been unmasked for its hypocrisy. Rather than obsoleting big tobacco, JUUL is very much part of it. It is as though they lit the kindling, stood by making no effort to contain the resulting fire, even stoked it, and when the fire department came, expressed shock and dismay about the resulting major conflagration while loudly protesting that their actions had absolutely nothing to do with it. Thank you. So that lays
Thank you, Dr. Jackler.
That lays down a model. Now, that group of interns, together with Divya Ramamurthy and I, and Lori helped as well, we wrote a treatise, a white paper. It's about 80 pages long, and we published it online in last January. Now, this has been widely used by regulators, legislatures, and in the legal process because it revealed how JUUL advertised. We were actually collecting in real time in 2015 when they launched, and we followed, and we were able to capture much of their advertising and marketing behavior. We have some approximately 2,200 images, which you can see online from JUUL promotion, 83 videos, 138 comparisons between JUUL marketing and tobacco marketing. Now, JUUL is an extraordinarily successful company. It started as a small startup, and it achieved Deca unicorn status, $10 billion, faster than any other company. And in fact, it displaced a company you might have heard of in that, called Facebook. By December 2018, and we'll talk about the drivers of this, JUUL had an incredible valuation of $38 billion after 3.5 years in existence. Still is a rapidly growing startup. So what drove this? You know, you see this data, you notice all of the other e-cigarette companies going down, but JUUL rocketing up to 75% of the market. Now, this is Nielsen data in convenience stores and gas stations and those kinds of things. But it became extraordinarily successful. The net effect on teenagers was that the reduction in teen nicotine addiction by fewer and fewer cigarettes took a rapid inflection in 2016 and rapidly grew, and that curve has continued upward as a whole generation of young kids get exposed to nicotine, with quite a few of them becoming addicted. Now, in September 2018, the then FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb first called this an epidemic of youth nicotine addiction, followed by the Surgeon General Jerome Adams a few months later. Now, in the 2018 data, you can see that about 27% of American teens were using tobacco product, of which about 21% were using vapor. Now, if you look at the actual data, it went up between 27 and 2018 by a robust 38% in a year. So the rate of rise of teens using these products is very impressive. Now, this is brand new data published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And you can see at the top that past 30-day use of a vaping device by a 12th grader is at 25% and an 8th grader at 9%. If you go down and say ever use, 40% of American high school seniors have used vapor devices and over 20% of 8th graders. And this is 2019 data. Now, our first academic interest in JUUL began with the concept of why is the device becoming successful? And one of its attributes is that it's very stealthy. So if it's on a table next to a kid, can you see it? Can you find the JUUL? There it is. And so a stealth vaporizer, we said, is if it was left on a teenager's desk or bedside table, a parent would not recognize it as a vaping device. It looks like a USB flash memory stick. That's by intention. Although, as I pointed out to the JUUL owners, I said, you know, USB sticks are going away. We're all going into the cloud. They're going to look like Super 8 tapes in a few years. I don't need to suggest their new design. So there are a number of these stealthy vaporizers. There are vaporizers that look like pens. There are vaporizers hidden in Tic Tac boxes, in coffee cups, in car fob lookalikes. These are particularly insidious. These look like asthma inhalers. You can imagine, you know, something like a third of U.S. kids in school have an asthma inhaler. They're sitting in the back, oh, it's my asthma. And they're actually taking nicotine, you know. Now, this is really creative. This is vaporware. This is actually a hoodie sweatshirt that has the vapor device in the drawstring. This is a very creative industry. Now, this was a year ago, but we looked at YouTube video counts, and JUULing in school and JUULing in a bathroom in school or in class. There are many, many youth videos produced. Hiding JUUL in school, a couple of thousand. Hiding JUUL from parents. Putting it in a Sharpie, as you can see. The kids get very, very clever. They learn that they can, because JUUL has a rather faint exhaled vapor. There are videos that show you blow it down the front of your jacket or you blow it into the backpack. Now, a key driver of JUUL's success has been its sweet and fruity flavors. And you can see there are a variety of different flavors, and more flavors come out periodically and come and go. Creme brulee, fruit medley, mango, those kinds of things. Mango has been intensely popular amongst young kids. You can see this on social media. This is a typical social media posting by JUUL. You know, love, love, love the mango pods. I've tried none others. Now, they say that's a quote from someone named Melanie, but of course it markets it. That's a marketing slogan saying how much you love the mango. We looked and categorized, and mango was most heavily marketed by JUUL via social media. Now, if I say to you, as this ad does, save room for blank, fill in the blank, right? Save room for dessert. JUUL is a treat, a sweet treat. It's creme brulee. What sort of message does that send? Kids have a sweet tooth. You know, I've been asked that before in an interview. Well, I like, you know, cotton candy flavored. A vape store owner called in. I said, yeah, that may be true, but go in an aisle in your supermarket where there's cereals, and you can see where the Lucky Charms and Cocoa Puffs are, and you can see where the shredded wheat and Cheerios are. You know, one's down at knee levels. There's a differential appeal of sweet and fruity flavors for young people. Now, JUUL, under intense regulatory scrutiny in November 2018, stopped selling e-cigarette flavors in stores. They only sell now Virginia tobacco and mint. Now, it's kind of interesting. You buy them online, and JUUL said that they had a big drop in their sales of sweet flavors because of it. But you know, JUUL's pretty shrewd because it could afford a 50% drop. Because when you sell in retail, you sell at a wholesale price, right? So you sell at about 50% of the price and there's a retail markup. When you sell it yourself, and a JUUL pod is sold 4 for $16, $4 each roughly, right? When they sell it themselves, they get the whole thing. When they sell it through retail, they get half of it roughly, okay, because of the wholesale price. So they were made whole despite that, I suspect. Now, JUUL advertises and professes that it's taken flavored products out of stores, but they still have their mint and menthol, and guess what has happened? As mango goes out of the retail environment, the kids have all swung over to mints, and they love the mint flavors, and that's been upswinging. Now, this is a Los Angeles gas station 5 months after JUUL said it was not going to sell flavors in the retail environment, and it's filled with flavors. Lori and I were in New York City going to bodegas and corner grocery stores, and JUUL flavor pods were still there many months after JUUL said that they weren't going to. And I would interview the store owner. I'd say, hey, I know they were taking these off the market. Is this, what you had in the back room you're selling? Oh, no, they still distribute it to us every week. So, it has not worked the way they said.
So what would a ban do, Dr. Jackler?
Well, thanks for having me on today, Katie. A ban in flavors is important because we now have 5 million American teenagers, high school students, that are using e-cigarettes on a routine basis. Almost all of the young people who start with e-cigarettes do so with sweet and fruity flavors like mango or butter rum or something like that. Taking those flavors off the market will help to reduce the fad-like popularity of vaping amongst young people. Adult smokers are very used to unsweetened tobacco flavor. They find it perfectly agreeable. But unsweetened tobacco flavor has no appeal to young people. By taking off all flavors except for unsweetened tobacco, will go a long ways to tamping down the use of vapor products by young people.
Now, what's happened recently, and you may be aware, there are 4 states that have either banned e-cigarettes or banned flavored e-cigarettes. And localities, 42 cities in California have banned the sale of flavored e-cigarettes. Some, like San Francisco, which was a leader in this, banned sales of all flavored tobacco products. Now, why is this important? For those of us old enough to remember, if you go back to the 1980s, a few cities began saying, hey, we're not, because of secondhand smoke, we're not going to allow smoking in bars or restaurants or in workplaces, or airplanes for that matter. And what happened gradually, it spread around cities and counties around America, worked its way up to the state level, and eventually we become largely smoke-free indoors, as we are throughout the country today. So this kind of grassroots upwelling from the local level is very important for regulation, because in the end of the day, with a product like JUUL, you're looking at a lot of parents and families that are really upset and passionate. And seldom do you find people getting engaged in the political process who are more passionate than when worried about the well-being of their kids. So these parents are important voters. The demographics of smoking tends to be more blue-collar. The demographics of vaping tend to be affluent kids in the suburbs who have discretionary income. Those parents have political clout. And it's not a red or blue thing, right? It's both across the divide. So recently, Melania, and I'm making this supposition, Barron, who's 13, Barron Trump, goes to school, comes home and talks to Melania about what he sees at school, and shortly thereafter, the president comes out and says, we're banning flavored e-cigarettes. Similarly, there's a bill coming up through Congress, through the committee that I visited with, Congressman Krishnamurthy, who's a good guy. Now, the FDA has had the authority to do something for a very long time, and it's out of the scope of what we're going to talk about today. But the FDA has really dragged its feet. Even though it was announcing it was an epidemic, they took precious little actions, and basically e-cigarettes have remained unregulated in the United States to this day. That's going to change. They all have to file by May next year. Now, I gave an editorial 2 weeks ago to the San Francisco Chronicle, and the caution that I was making is that if you pass a vapor ban of flavors, it's very easy to work around it. Remember, there are 2 kinds of vaping devices. There are the enclosed pods and cartridges, which are sold pre-mixed with nicotine liquid in them. But there are also open devices, like you see here, where you drip in the liquid. If you've been to a vape store, you'll see there are hundreds of little bottles, 30cc bottles, filled with flavor liquids and gummy bear and cotton candy and pizza and God knows what flavor, every flavor you can imagine. If you simply outlaw it, what they'll do is they'll sell flavorless nicotine, and you then have racks of flavoring extracts that you drip in to flavor it. And I'm afraid that that will happen unless they're very careful. Now, we're all very keen as physicians in the health implications of vaping. Now, the vapor product, the e-liquid or e-juice, is made basically of glycerin and propylene glycol. And within that is mixed some nicotine and flavorants, okay? Now, look, there's nothing very natural about breathing in and out through your lungs a mist of propylene glycol and glycerin. We know from work such as Beth Dorenzo's work that it causes inflammation in mucosa and in the lung. And we know if you think about what causes eventually chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and even cancer is chronic pulmonary inflammation. If you start smoking today, it's going to be 30 or 40 years before you develop lung cancer. So I've always been worried about the long-term effects. So there are three ways you can assess the toxicity. You can look at the chemicals it makes when it vaporizes. And you say, okay, it has fewer of the known cancer-causing chemicals than a cigarette produces. That's certainly true. But it also produces novel chemicals that a cigarette never produced. And in fact, some of these bigger devices put out a lot of formaldehyde and other aldehydes that are known carcinogens. So there's reason to be concerned just about the base chemical. There's also reason to concern about flavors. So the vaping industry has used a library of thousands of flavorants the flavoring industry sells. And we know that some of those flavorants, while they're safe in the GI tract, the lung toxicity is a very different spectrum, isn't it, right? So we know, I hate to burst your bubble, but butter popcorn does not have butter, right? It's a diacetyl compound. And we know that workers in where they produce the butter flavor actually get severe restrictive lung disease if they inhale the mist from it. Here we're mixing many diacetyl compounds in a vapor, and kids are breathing them in and out all day. So the focus has been on long-term worries until a month or two ago. And all of a sudden, a group of clever physicians in Wisconsin recognized a group of younger people who were having serious lung problems. And you've probably all heard of this, but it's happened in 48 states. This is from the CDC. Early on, I had this sort of bias that it may be lipoid pneumonia. For example, elderly people having mineral oil as a laxative, it accidentally goes into the tracheobronchial tree, and it causes just horrible havoc. And so, many of these THC and CBD marijuana extracts are an oil base. But it turns out, recent data coming out of the Mayo Clinic, it looks more like a toxic burn. In fact, they said it's kind of similar to what they saw in World War I gas warfare, within the lungs. So there's some toxic chemical there. As of today, thank you, Lori, for sending this to me an hour ago, the current count is up to almost 1,300 cases and 27 deaths nationally. Now, I think what's been happening is these pulmonary problems from vaping have been hiding in plain sight. I mean, lung diseases are common. Young people get tracheobronchitis, they get asthma, they get lung diseases that are of serious nature, eosinophilic pneumonia, things. And I think what's happened is they've been there but mixed in with the fact that lung disease is very frequent in the population at large. Only now are people looking back and realizing that perhaps many of these illnesses in recent years have been tracked to vaping. There's a very interesting slide that looks at Illinois and Wisconsin. On the left side, you can see are the THC, and we think the dank vapes, which is kind of an off-brand, produced kind of in a gypsy way, often perhaps in someone's sink or someone's bathtub. There's a lot of that in the back room of vape stores where things are done unsterilely and they produce it. But what's interesting is there are a fair number of these folks who are getting lung disease who've only used nicotine vapes and not the THC. The CDC, you would have thought, would have solved this riddle already. It's been in the paper every day for now many weeks. The fact that the CDC didn't say, we know what it is, it's this particular product, tells you it's a heterogeneous group of vapor stuff. And it's actually pretty important because, if you tell a teen, if you start vaping or you start smoking, in 30 or 40 years from now, you might get really sick and you might die young or get cancer. Teenagers don't care. What we're finding now is if you tell them, look, use this, you may die next week, it actually gets their attention. So we're seeing a deflation of the JUUL bubble, which shouldn't really be surprising in a way, because JUUL has been driven by a teen fad. What we know about teen fads is it's a bad business model because they never last. I mean, if you ask a teenager today, what social media accounts do you use? And I'll ask them, well, do you use Facebook? Yeah, it's how I talk with my grandmother. They've all gone on to TikTok and Snapchat. And in a few years, it'll be something else. So I think JUUL will become yesterday's news at some point. Now, the key innovation of JUUL had to do with nicotine. The industry, the tobacco industry and regular cigarettes, thought that you need to make the nicotine alkaline to freebase it, because they wanted to have this massive influx through the lung, which is the surface area of like a football field, to absorb very quickly and give that rush to the brain. That's what's important. These guys discovered tobacco research from the 1970s and 80s that acidic nicotine, conjugated in this case with benzoic acid, was much more flavorful. It wasn't a problem. So they could actually ramp up the nicotine level to much higher levels, and the flavor still came through without the bitterness. And so here's what you see. The purple is a regular cigarette. This is from JUUL's patent. And you can see that JUUL mimics it. So JUUL very much puts into the bloodstream a very similar level. Many of the lower level e-cigarettes, they don't give that spike that the seriously addicted person wants. Now, one JUUL pod, 0.7 milliliters, delivers to the bloodstream of the user the same amount of nicotine with a similar pharmacodynamics to a pack of 20 Marlboro cigarettes. Now, because those 20 cigarettes have 170 milligrams and JUUL only 41, it tells you that JUUL is incredibly able. It's a very efficient nicotine delivery. Cigarettes, some of the nicotine is left in the butt of the cigarette, some of it smolders off the end, but JUUL is very efficient.
It turns out tobacco companies have kind of worked on this quite a bit. And after the Master Settlement Agreement, all of these documents were made public. You can find this at tobaccodocuments.org. This is a $1 billion investment project by RJR in 1980s dollars. An unbelievably huge project that barely saw the light of day. And it's free, it's free domain at this point. You can learn all about it.
So that's James Muncie, one of the co-founders. And these guys have forever said, oh, they didn't really understand what the tobacco industry did. They knew very well what the tobacco industry was doing. They studied it. Here's an RJR memo about a cigarette concept to assure RJR a larger segment of the youth market. Notice its additional nicotine kick through manipulating pH of the product. And that's exactly what JUUL's innovation was. And in fact, if you look at what do teenagers think is in JUUL, many of them think it's water mist. They have no idea that it even has nicotine, let alone, they don't understand what addiction is. You know, they wake up in the morning and they have to suck on their JUUL, right? But they don't know that that's a sine qua non of being addicted. They don't understand it. So JUUL had no nicotine warning. It listed the percentage, or maybe very fine print somewhere, but it wasn't until just last year that they had a nicotine warning. Now, we wrote a paper, and I coined the term the nicotine arms race. Because, you know, when you're as successful as JUUL, you're going to have a lot of imitators, and that's exactly what happened. So when JUUL came on the market, the typical e-cigarette was 1 or 2% nicotine. And JUUL came out with 5% nicotine, much, much more than that. And in fact, it was, 2 or 3% was considered for the 2-pack-a-day smoker. And you can see a JUUL pod at 5%, and right away you start to get all these knockoffs with JUUL-compatible pods. And in fact, then you have a whole bunch of what we call JUUL-alikes. When you're that successful financially, people rip you off. Now, we've seen a picture of a table in a Southern California high school with all of the confiscated vaping devices in recent months. And JUUL is just a corner. And many other, Fix and Swarn and others, some of them you may have heard of them, are also very highly represented. Why? They're cheaper, and the kids will downtrade. So this is from our study, and a JUUL pod may be $4, but there are other pods that are $3 or even $2.50, and kids have limited discretionary income. So it's a big threat to JUUL's business model that people downtrade. JUUL, of course, is suing everybody, is trying to make all these, what they call competitors, they call them counterfeiters. Most of them aren't counterfeiters, they're simply competitors that rushed into the market. Now, for those of you who have been to vape stores, you know that 30 cc bottles of liquid are typical. And you can see these are super high nicotine, 55 milligrams, even 60 milligrams of nicotine in sweet and fruity flavors. And, they've got Fruit Loops or Pink Burst. If this is sitting on a table at home, a kid's going to pick that up and drink it.
The first time I JUULed was at the end of 8th grade. My friend handed it to me, and I had no idea what it was.
That's 15-year-old Philip Furman speaking at a New York City Council health meeting.
When I started hearing all the facts and everything bad about it, it was already too late. I was already hooked onto it.
Philip's story has become shockingly familiar. You've probably heard of JUUL by now. It's been around since June of 2015. And millions of high school students have already JUULed or vaped using the device. What you may not know, however, is how JUUL's high 5% nicotine pods have caused a so-called nicotine arms race across the vaping industry.
When JUUL came on the market 3.5 years ago, the vapor market was mostly 1 and 2% nicotine. It's now 6, 7% nicotine. Now this tiny JUUL cartridge delivers to a person's body the same amount of nicotine as this entire box of Camels of 20 cigarettes.
Stanford professor Dr. Robert Jackler makes his case in a study in the BMJ journal Tobacco Control. His research group has been tracking the industry for nearly a decade.
When JUUL came out with very high nicotine electronic cigarettes, it triggered a nicotine arms race amongst competitive companies seeking to emulate the success of JUUL.
JUUL is now winning the race.
So JUUL, listening to all sorts of criticism, decides they're going to offer a lower level, 3%. Do they choose mango and cream? Nah. They choose Virginia tobacco and mint, the kinds that appeal perhaps to adult smokers. We also did a paper called The Plummeting Price of Nicotine Addiction, and it's kind of interesting. On average in America, a pack of Marlboro cigarettes is about $8. JUUL is about $4 for the same amount of nicotine. But if you use a 30 cc liquid, which is about $15 for the salt nicotine, it gets the equivalent amount of nicotine to a pack of Marlboro cigarettes for 40-something cents, right? So you can realize that kids, it matters a lot. We long have known that raising the price of cigarette products deters young people from starting. So this is a concern. Just a new bill, this is just from October 7th, has been proposed to cap nicotine level in the U.S. at 2%. And that would equal what Europe has done. Now, one proposal that we have made in this is that we tax alcohol in America on a sliding scale. You actually pay more for alcohol tax for hard liquor than you do beer and wine. Right now, only 10 states tax e-cigarettes, and there's no federal tax at all. And those 10 states are completely agnostic to nicotine level. It makes no sense. I mean, it really should cost more for nicotine because that is the substance of most concern. Now, nicotine poisoning, a kid goes out and he sees a cookie thing and it smells like cookies, they're going to chug it down. And there have been over 3,000 poison control calls for nicotine toxicity in America. There have been a number of deaths of toddlers that have picked up these bottles and chugged them down. And these are extremely high. So 55 milligrams, it turns out 1 cc of that is a lethal dose for a toddler. A teaspoon could kill 5 toddlers, and a single 30 cc bottle has enough nicotine in it to kill a preschool class of 20. So this is very dangerous stuff, and it will even absorb through the skin. Now, when a person starts smoking as a teenager, right? You have a cigarette and you start coughing. If you try to have 2 or 3 cigarettes, you might lose your lunch, right? But with vaping, with JUUL, it's soft. It's easy to suck the stuff in. And when you're a teenager and something's popular, you want to do the most of it. I mean, when I was a teen, boys had long hair. I wanted the longest hair. We had bell bottoms. I wanted the widest bell bottoms. And if I was a teen now, I'd probably be sucking down 3 JUUL pods in an afternoon just to show that I belong, right? And that's how teens behave. And there have been even teens that get nicotine toxic enough to seize because they take so much in. But because it's so easy to suck in a huge amount of nicotine, the kids feel a head buzz. They think it helps them study. They think it helps them take a test better, right? They actually become addicted very quickly. It doesn't take much to addict them because it's so extraordinarily potent, much more potent from this point of view than regular smoking. The business model of JUUL is like Gillette razors, or like when you go out and you buy a computer and they give you a printer, and that printer, oh, it's great, a freebie printer for like $30, and you suddenly realize the ink costs a fortune. Well, that's JUUL's market is selling the pods, right? So they give big discounts, and they even hand out freebies. And so sometimes they even say, if you give one to a friend, we'll give you money. It's actually recruiting their users to become members of their marketing team. Now, one question is, adult smokers, how good are these vapor products in helping adult smokers quit? They do reproduce hand-to-mouth and suctioning the way you would as opposed to a patch or a gum. Now, the cig-alikes didn't have enough nicotine to satisfy an adult smoker. But the advanced personal vaporizers, even with lower nicotine, they put out a huge cloud. And they have a disadvantage. They heat the liquid up very hot because they have high-powered coil and a big battery. That produces aldehyde, sometimes heavy metals, off the coil. JUUL actually may be a safer device for the adult smoker because it's a lower temperature and a lower volume that way. Now, the New England Journal in February published that 18% with e-cigarettes as opposed to 10% with nicotine replacement. That's pretty good at a year. However, you need to realize this was a structured thing with medical support and counseling. This wasn't just somebody doing this alone at home. So this is not a panacea. It does help, and it may be more useful than just patches and gums. Now, the advertising, which is what we study, e-cigarettes have always advertised their products to be for smoking cessation. So sometimes they say, okay, very explicit, use this to get rid of your cigarettes. But it shows you how hard it is to write regulations. Because the blue ad on the side says, it works for me. It doesn't say what it works for, right? This is the difference between content analysis. A lawyer would say, they made no claim about smoking, but 100% of consumers looking at that know exactly what it means. How about this other one, Plan A with an X versus Plan B? You know that's marketed as a smoking cessation device. Now, are e-cigarettes in teenagers a gateway to subsequent use of more dangerous tobacco products? And the answer is, in one study, some close to a third of teenagers who begin and get nicotine addicted with JUUL start using combustible cigarettes and other tobacco products. That's very concerning. Now, let's just take a quick look at JUUL advertising. So when JUUL launched in 2015 for the first 6 months, their advertisements had 20-something models, playful, doing things that young people do in very bright and vibrant colors. Professional advertisers know this is how you target underage kids who want to be like their older brothers and sisters. They want to emulate them. Now, who does this look like to you? Can anybody shout it out?
Ariana Grande.
Yeah, you got it. I don't think that was an accident at all. It looks very much like American singer Ariana Grande. When they first put into magazines, what magazine did they choose? Vice Digital. What does Vice Digital say its market is? We're the #1 youth media company in the world. Remember, lifestyle-oriented? We're not targeting kids? Okay. The advertising agency they used for this was called Cult Creative. As I said, they were trying to make a cult-like following. Now, ad agencies are professionals. They know who their ads target. They even do studies. It's scientific. Modern advertising is very scientific. Now, they follow the instructions of their clients. So if JUUL went to these guys and said, we want to target middle-aged smokers, age 30 to 60, which is most of the smokers, it would have been a very different type of advertising. So the company clearly instructed them to advertise in this way. There was a display in Times Square. It was very youth-oriented. This was in mid-2015 as JUUL launched in the first couple of months. There's a long history, actually, of animated billboards in Times Square. You can see the blowing smoke out of Camel that went on for many years. Now, this is what I referred to in the congressional testimony. I thought it would be useful for you just to hear it.
When we launched JUUL, we had a campaign that was arguably too kind of lifestyle-oriented and too flashy. It lasted less than 6 months. It was in the early days of product introduction. We think it had no impact on sales.
Okay. So it had no impact on sales. It was lifestyle-oriented. Come on, give me a break. It was targeted at the young people. This is how they're massaging it. But it's very interesting. We have a whole collection of founder videos, and we clipped this from 6 months into it. This is the other company.
Now we're actually the fastest growing e-cigarette company in the world, which is pretty awesome. And we introduced this thing 7 months ago.
Right. So that's what they were saying then. That's what they say now. I find it's sort of a 60-minute moment. You sort of get them back to back. It's very revealing. Now, JUUL, in its launch, had many events throughout the United States, and these were all about sampling. They would call in influencers. They were highly youth-oriented. They focused on music and other forms of entertainment. Many of the people there were very young, engaged in very young behaviors as they sucked on their JUULs. And this is the beginning of the use of hashtags, which we'll explore in a minute, as you can see there. JUUL created a number. As we're Californians, this one is in Los Angeles in a cemetery. where they showed movies all night long. Frequently, they have girls that are minimally dressed, they're attractive, and they're handing out free samples. Not uncommon. I'm not sure I'd take a free sample from that guy with a look on his face, but if you notice at the bottom, it says they're sampling 5,000 plus per event. I mean, that's unbelievable. That's a huge number of samples. Again, get the devices out there, and people will buy the pods. Now, when they found out they could not give away samples for free, it was not legal, they started charging $1. It's a typical thing. The tobacco industry escapes almost any regulation or attempt to constrain it. And, they say they don't do it anymore, but here you are. 1 year ago, they launched in Canada, and they gave away 1,000 starter kits. How about underage sales? The retail market is a sieve, right? The FDA themselves had a bunch of young people go into stores all over America, and they found that there was huge leakage. 1,300 realtors would sell to underage kids. The average, minimum wage person behind the convenience store, bodega, or gas station, they don't know that it's not okay to sell to kids. So some 3/4 of product getting to young kids are going through the retail environment leakage. So recently, in the last week or two, Walmart, Walgreens, and a number of chain stores have stopped carrying e-cigarettes and don't sell them. There's a very interesting observation we had about JUUL's practice. We had several of our interns that were either under 21 or under 18 try to buy from JUUL's website. And sure enough, JUUL says they have a very hermetic third-party company that screens when you try to buy it online. You can go to their website, that's no problem. But if you actually want to purchase something, you have to give your social and all sorts of things. Sure enough, well, these kids, including a 16-year-old, 2 hours later got a welcome to JUUL email. Because when you fill it out, you have to put in your email, and then got a $20 off coupon, and then got an invitation to buy mango, right? So can you believe it? So they reject these kids as underage, and then they turn around and add them to their email marketing list for discounts. So JUUL social media was the principal driver of youth, and it fed a fad, a craze, what we call in medicine an epidemic, just like Beanie Babies and fidget spinners. Now, this gets down to advertising channels, right? So baby boomers and Gen Xers live largely in paper newspapers of the digital equivalent, magazines, radio, broadcast TV. Gen Xers, Gen Zs, and Gen Y, they live on social media. They live on Instagram and Snapchat, things like that. So we've collected a lot of social media in the SRITA collection, and you get things like this. Here's Katy Perry. If you notice, her left hand has a JUUL in it. They put this all over Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter as an influencer, saying that she's using our JUUL product. Now, hashtag JUUL is become, all these hashtags have been very potent. JUUL would post its own things, and then kids would post with it. And so what you find is that there's this huge viral teen participation with hashtag JUUL for a lot of these are very representative underage kinds of things you see, including the JUUL hand sign. You can all do that if you wish. Now, with Divya's help, we got Keyhole, which is a social media analytical program. And so over a short time this July, we looked at 7,400 postings to Instagram. Now, it turns out, multiply that times 100 for engagement, 706,000 that gave comments or likes so that they actually engaged with it. But the number of viewers, passive viewers, was undoubtedly much more than that. So all of these postings to JUUL hashtag, right, have become the place to go if you're a teenager. Somewhat about vaping and somewhat about other things. So when JUUL first launched, there were a series of posts they made. They created hashtags like hashtag JUUL. Others created hashtags as well. But JUUL would post to like hashtag New York City, for example, with their hundreds of millions putting it there. By fall of 2018, you can see they're posting to Throwback Tuesday and hashtag Miami, but also there's a wide number of JUUL hashtags. We did content analysis. Nearly 70% were youthful. In June 2018, again, when the FDA is breathing down their neck, they say they'll no longer use models, only testimonials from adult smokers. And then in June 2018, they purged the youth-oriented content. And as we like to say, then they deleted it all, not just youth-oriented. They completely wiped their social media, except for product support on Twitter. As we like to say, just because you deleted it doesn't mean it didn't happen. So we've collected a lot of it, although they've gotten down probably quite a bit of the worst of it they've removed that we didn't get a hold of. Now here's a really key point. So in November 2018, JUUL stops posting, and it says at that time, we are less than 1% of the posts on hashtag JUUL. Well, sure enough, hashtag JUUL zooms on and grows at a huge rate. And it's still there today. If you go on Instagram to hashtag JUUL, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of new posts every day and every week from kids. And so we went to JUUL and said, guys, this is your trademark, right? If I go hashtag Coca-Cola, I hate it, Coca-Cola is going to come to me and say, shut it down, it's our trademark. JUUL could go to them and shut down all the JUUL vaping ones. There are a few Dutchmen named JUUL spelled the same way. They can have it, although it'll probably get taken over by the kids, you know. But, and then, you know, we also want Instagram under their community practice standards about public harm. There can be very few things more harmful than addicting millions of American teenagers on the computer.
You would have thought that hashtag posting would decline, but in fact, it surged.
Surged in part because the hashtag itself gained a kind of social currency, even after the brand had largely exited social media. Jackler and others say this video should scare anyone, normalizing the use of these devices, even in a young toddler.
We've seen lots of outrageous postings on hashtag JUUL. It's remarkable the lack of boundaries many posters have.
So JUUL used influencers.
She's made her living as a blogger and social media influencer. One of her recent jobs, post positive content about the e-cigarette JUUL.
They really wanted to appeal to the younger market, and they did.
JUUL had hired an influencer marketing firm, which then reached out to the then 35-year-old Christina in September of 2017, hoping to target her 57,000 Instagram followers.
If you are a smoker, then please let me know your interest in a collaboration with JUUL.
Christina shared that 5% of her followers are in the 13 to 17 age range. They're especially susceptible to being influenced, according to Stanford researcher Dr. Robert Jackler, who's been following JUUL since early marketing campaigns more than 3 years ago.
They advertise exactly where young people live. Young people today are on social media. They're on their phones continuously throughout the day looking at social media channels.
JUUL's team reached out to me to work together. We came up with working on a sponsored post, which is just a blog post, and then one Instagram post. Their budget was, okay, we can offer you $1,000.
JUUL declined an on-camera interview, but conceded it paid fewer than 10 influencers who were all smokers or former smokers and collectively paid less than $10,000.
I think it's incumbent also upon the companies that are marketing these products to also take.
So they said they spent almost nothing, but they hired a bunch of people. So they, right from the very beginning, they hired an influencer marketing person. They had influencer managers internal to the company. They obviously spent a heck of a lot more than $10,000. Then they contracted, well, this is an invitation to become an influencer. So they contract, and this is right at the beginning. They want 280 influencers in LA and LA and New York, social buzz makers, 28,000 in the top tier influencers. They would go after celebrities. They would give them a unique URL key. They would send gifts to their managers to get them there. They would have a VIP portal for celebrities with, quote, white glove JUUL.com customer experience with exclusive discounts. So they had a very robust influencer. They downplay it, but it was very important. They also had an affiliate program. Now, what that means is if you go online and somebody writes a great review, and the review says what wonderful thing JUUL is, and at the bottom says, if you really are interested in JUUL, click on this, you can buy it. That came with a 20% kickback of the price of purchase. So you had all these very favorable reviews because of the affiliates. Now, that closed down last October. So what happens is there are 4 segments to JUUL's advertising. The second segment is it looks a lot like tobacco advertising, but it goes on social media. It features romance, relaxation, friendship, and holidays. And then when the regulators are on them and there are articles all over the newspaper about what's happening with the JUUL crisis with teens, they turn over to showing middle age. This is the only time in over 50,000 tobacco ads I've seen an 80-year-old's hands. I mean, you just don't see this. Tobacco advertising is almost always young people. And they have things like this: quit, start smoking, quit, quit, quit. And you know, if you listen to James Monsi's interviewed at Congress, he says, oh, we're not a cessation device. What do you think these things say? I mean, it's really pretty obvious what it's saying. And in fact, in early September, the FDA said, you can't make modified risk claims, which means reduced risk claims. So JUUL is saying, switch from cigarettes to JUUL. The message is because it's healthier and safer. And in order to do that, the FDA says you have to apply for a modified risk certification that requires very rigorous scientific proof, which they probably would not get, I'm quite sure. So actually, on September 25th of this year, JUUL halted all marketing. So the roots of JUUL in traditional tobacco ads. If you look at traditional tobacco ads, it's very much there. Now, it's been much commented on, but we had a field trip. And our JUUL summer interns, along with Cindy and Divya and Lori and I, we went up to JUUL, and we had a 2-hour meeting, and it was mostly co-founder James Monsi's and I talking. And the first thing he does is he says, oh, you remember I came and visited you when we were setting up JUUL and asked you about advertising. And I said, oh, really? I didn't remember. But apparently they did. And then he said something that really stuck with all of us who were there that day. He said, you know, your database is so good, it was very helpful when we set up JUUL marketing. And that led to this.
He thanked us for the database that we have of 50,000 traditional tobacco ads online. He said they were very helpful as they designed JUUL's advertising. And in fact, we know very well, having studied tobacco advertising, that JUUL's marketing faithfully recapitulates the methods used by the tobacco industry to target young people.
Testifying the next day, Monsi's denied the allegation.
I did not make that statement to Dr. Jackler. I think that, unfortunately, Dr. Jackler may have misheard my commentary. In fact, the resource that he compiled is a useful resource. And at that point, we were very interested in using his resource to understand exactly what bad actions those tobacco companies have taken, to familiarize ourselves with how not to run a business.
You know, I think these guys were very smart. You know, the tobacco industry is perhaps unique in the most effective advertising, creating a product in the 20th century that was essential for all parts of life, from the time you woke up in the morning to the time you went to bed at night. If you're trying to create a new tobacco product and you want to advertise it, why reinvent the wheel?
All right, so I'm going to leave this for you to judge. I'm going to show you some examples. You tell me whether Monsi's was telling the truth or Jackler was telling the truth. Now, why do you prejudge? All right, so let's look at JUUL versus Marlboro. So on the left, you see Marlboro with its red roof, the red chevron. There, it's the leading youth initiation cigarette. JUUL is the leading youth initiation cigarette. And notice the similarity of the original design. You know who actually thought that they were copying Marlboro? Marlboro thought they were copying Marlboro, and they sued JUUL. And in fact, JUUL had to change their design. I mean, this is like, no, we never copied them. You know, of course, why not? Marlboro is the leading cigarette in the world. Why not copy it, right? These guys copied tobacco in their design and their nicotine. Why not do it in their marketing? And here they are. This is Congressman Krishnamurthy pointing at, this is a Stanford poster. So here, JUUL comes out with some special colors. Do they look at all like the Marlboro brand colors? It comes out with advertising of flavors. Does it look like it? They have women with short skirt, short, whatever those are, giving away, JUUL. They have very similar, things. Marlboro on the left, JUUL on the right. Does this look at all similar? I think it looks awfully similar. Now look at these. Above is JUUL, below is Marlboro. I mean, they look amazingly similar in thematics and composition. Above is Marlboro, below is You're the cadence of the music. It's JUUL just ripped them off. Now, this literally is coming out shortly in the media because it's not widely known, but JUUL and Marlboro are collaborating And this is from Savannah, Georgia, in a Publix supermarket last week. And what it is, it's a JUUL discount coupon coming out of a Marlboro Gold box. And you can see it expires on October 31st of this month. So JUUL and tobacco, put aside Marlboro, you look at these motifs, Lucky Strike, cool, blowing smoke rings. Those, by the way, are wedding rings in the Lucky Strike ad. You know, relaxation, very similar. Socialization. The best mom ever, or I remember Mom and Dad in the Chesterfield ad. The kid wants his inheritance at a younger age. You can see this, you know, smart. You're so smart to use JUUL. You're so smart to use Parliament. You know, this is smoking evolved, and that's the miracle tip. You know, surprise, give JUUL for Valentine's Day to your loved one. Same thing for Lark cigarettes with the charcoal filter. Here she says, you know, I don't have that terrible odor, and my teeth are white, not yellow. And Old Gold said, keep kissable, smoke Old Gold. You know, these are all themes that have been there in tobacco right along. In fact, I looked at James Monsees and I said, you guys remember this who were there. And I said, you know, you guys ripped off American Spirit's colors. And he didn't say no. He looked down and had sort of a Cheshire Cat grin. Because it's pretty obvious. I mean, tobacco ads don't have those bright soda colors, one. And, of course, American Spirit's very popular amongst young people because it advertises being natural and organic, as though it would kill you any less. It is not. So, you know, when he says that the study of tobacco advertising history did not inform JUUL in terms of their ads, there's no credibility to that. And in fact, everybody who's seen that, and even in the Congress, there was a bunch of laughing behind because it just is completely disingenuous in that way. Now, JUUL also started the teen education program. Now, there's a long history of the tobacco industry going into schools and saying things like, smoking is an adult habit, you're too young and won't be permitted to do it. Now, what do you think a teenager is going to say to that one, right? So JUUL says we're going to put $30 million into going into schools, and they start offering schools $20,000, and guess what? They ripped off Bonnie Halpern Felcher, very distinguished Stanford professor, her own education program.
Stanford sent JUUL a cease and desist letter demanding that JUUL stop using their acclaimed youth vaping prevention curriculum because it was misappropriating it. JUUL had taken the materials of Dr. Bonnie Halpern Felcher without her consent, removed key portions including the role of industry and marketing in promoting nicotine use, and misrepresented an affiliation with Stanford. JUUL's key deletions downplayed the health effects of JUUL.
We were told that we were having a mental health / addiction seminar that we have 3 times a year, and the teachers are told to leave the room.
Did the presenter call JUUL, quote-unquote, totally safe more than once?
Yes.
What impact did those, quote-unquote, totally safe comments have on your classmates, some of whom may have already started vaping?
For my classmates who are already vaping, it was a sigh of relief.
And for those classmates who had never yet vaped, it was an invitation to begin using JUUL. JUUL also does what the tobacco industry does. It does junk science. So the tobacco industry for years has gone out to pliant scientists with a marketing slogan, and that the scientists will find it. And they did the same. So, for example, we know that youth interest in JUUL is very high, so they sponsor in this Glasgow, Scotland, Centre for Substance Use Research, who works for all different tobacco companies. And surprisingly, every time the finding is completely aligned with the business interest of the sponsoring tobacco company. Surprising how that works, isn't it? And so they find things like, you know, prevalence of 30-day use is less than 5%. Well, you've seen the data we showed from the federal government. Flavored pods are unlikely to be a significant driver of use among youth. Come on, give me a break. So they use this for regulatory defense. They say that it's very useful for quitting when, you know, 76% and 60%. Well, it's nowhere near that number. And JUUL puts out press releases as though this was proven fact in high-quality science, whereas when you look at the papers and you look at the data, they're not in high-end journals, of course. It really is very flawed research that should never have been published. Now, JUUL is also trying very hard to have universities, including Stanford, accept money from them. But it's very interesting when you look at this. So they say, and this is from their application, because I actually went and started to fill out an application because I wanted to see what it looked like. And it said, under no circumstances will JUUL permit involvement of the sales or marketing associates in any aspect. Yeah, right. I mean, give me a break. Well, think about it. The company shouldn't be selecting what the research is, because then they'll take in, like the tobacco industry used to do this, they take in all of these requests for funding, and the ones that involved non-smoking related lung cancer, they would fund, right? So they would choose things that would serve their business interests. There should be nobody from the company in any kind of company-funded research that is involved in selecting or determining who gets second and third year funding, whether or not it aligns to their business interests. JUUL's future in the United States may be very limited, but globally it's seeking to reproduce the success it's had in America. You can see all over the world they're starting to go throughout Europe and Asia and the Middle East. And they will say that we have no higher priority than combating youth use. We are the most aggressive of anyone in the industry against underage. And they say that one of the key things they did is they stopped selling non-tobacco, non-menthol JUUL pods. No more sweet and fruity pods. But Canada, right next door, this is when they launched in Canada, all the sweet and fruity pods are there. Throughout France, the UK. So if they're saying, this is hypocritical, right? They're saying that selling these things, sweet and fruity flavors over the counter is an invitation to kids. They do it everywhere else in the world, but not in the U.S. Now, of course, youth culture is international. So when you look through social media and what kids like in music and kids like in popularity, it's going to be very easy, and it started already, to recapitulate and reproduce JUUL's phenomenal growth in America in all these other countries. And that's what they're trying to do. And you can see here mango flavors all over Europe. The United Kingdom, this is now just, I was giving a lecture in the UK, and it comes from that. And they're appearing in the corner grocery stores and convenience stores all over the United Kingdom. Now, with the recent onset of severe vaping injuries, India has banned e-cigarettes, and China, where JUUL just launched in the last, really, days, China inhibited them. Alibaba took down JUUL sales, for example. JUUL lobbies. So it's spending a lot of money, an increasing amount of money, lobbying at every level, from the local level on up to the federal level. And they will go out and, the day that San Francisco adopts a flavored ban, JUUL blasts out an email saying, we want you to go advocate for us. Overturn that. The flavors are very important for adult smokers, right? And they also do Trojan horse legislation. What does that mean? Well, they're saying, let's increase the age from 18 to 21. Well, that's mom and apple pie. Although I would point out many states are already 21 or 18 or 19, and huge amounts of their product is getting in the hands of young kids despite it. But what this is all about is state preemption. Remember, the grassroots stuff from cities and towns is what drives forward, innovative tobacco protection for young people. They put poison pills in these state legislation that preempts its weak structure, and it preempts local ordinances from coming up. And the JUUL Switch Network, they solicit people to call your elected officials, go to public rallies, sign petitions and the likes. Here's the one for California. Tell your lawmakers how flavors helped you switch, and they will send it on to the congressman and the state representative in your area for you. As you know, San Francisco adopted, there's coming this November, just a month from now, Prop C, which JUUL, under its new leadership, has abandoned. But they were trying to overturn not only San Francisco's ban on e-cigarettes, which is a complicated issue, but also the flavor ban that was put in. So JUUL has had all sorts of legal troubles. So last October the 2nd, just over a year ago, the FDA raided JUUL and took out all sorts of documents about their marketing and things like that. There are many states that are involved. The attorneys generals are suing JUUL. I've spoken with many of them. many more than on this list. Interestingly enough, the Iowa Attorney General actually nominated and wrote a tribute for Adam Bowen and James Monsees as one of the 100 most influential people in Time magazine. I'll be darned. Well, it turns out Time, and I've got to give credit to Jamie Ducharme, because I spoke with her a number of times about it. She did a terrific article actually later in the year, just actually a few weeks ago, and it was really outstanding about vaping. There are many individual and class action lawsuits all over the country cropping up against JUUL. There are also criminal actions against JUUL, both federally and state, and both FDA and other organizations. So coming towards the end, what about policy? So you would like to put together a policy that inhibited youth uptake of these devices, but made them available for adult smokers, right? You'd like to transition, ideally, to quit. These are not cessation products. It's not designed to, like, you know, chew the gum a little less each day till you quit. That's a lousy business model. These are replacement. You're supposed to switch to vaping, but it may prove, or may not, to be healthier over the long term. The problem with these devices, they are somewhat promising off-ramp for adult smokers, yet to be proven, but they are a heavily trafficked on-ramp for teen non-smokers. And when, as public health people, as medical practitioners, when you're considering public health priorities, you would always bend over backwards to protect the kids first. And when you think about it, because smoking initiation is a teen phenomenon, the way to eliminate adult smoking in the population is to keep kids from getting hooked in the first place. Hooking kids is what the industry calls replacement smokers. And that's why most tobacco advertising for the last 75 years has been aimed at recruiting kids to get started. So some of the options, one, ban all flavors other than unsweetened and intense. You can't just say tobacco flavor, or you'll have butter tobacco flavor and rum tobacco flavor. It has to be unsweetened, and it has to be intense enough, or kids will mix it with fruity flavors. You need to limit the nicotine concentration, but maybe allow the high nicotine by prescription only. Now, my concern about that is how easy it is to get, in the old days, a medical marijuana prescription or a Viagra prescription over the phone, and that worries me a bit in that way. Taxing nicotine on a sliding scale. Why? Kids don't want the nicotine. Most don't even know it's there, right? So if something is $10 and something is $6, they'll buy the cheaper one because they really just want to look cool with the sweet and fruity thing. It can have zero nicotine from the point of view of most kids. And so price makes a big difference when it comes to teens. How about advertising? The rest of the world can ban tobacco advertising. America has the First Amendment. It is not only private speech, it is commercial speech. There are some things you can do. For example, if they make a therapeutic claim, use this to cease smoking, in theory the FDA can then say you need to apply for modified risk, or maybe you're even a drug and have to go through the nightmare of drug approval as opposed to the Center of Tobacco Products. I always like, this is from 2003, the very last tobacco ad in England for the Silk Cut brand was the fat lady singing. That was the end of tobacco advertising in the United Kingdom. All right, so cigarette ads have not been on radio or TV in the US since 1971, but for those of you who watch TV and broadcast TV, they've been all over the place for JUUL and Views and others, but they're now taking them down. Just in the last few weeks, CNN, CBS, and others are refusing to carry these ads. Now, JUUL, as you recall, has always said that it is not big tobacco. It positioned itself as a rebel outsider, a disruptive force to obsolete the tobacco industry. Well, JUUL is kind of between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, the biggest commercial threat to JUUL is the proliferation of copycat devices which sell the consumables, and this is the main profit, is selling the nicotine pods over and over at a lower price. So they would like to create very complicated regulations. They'd like to have standards of purity and good manufacturing that would be beyond the financial ability of the many startups in the vaping segment. So the problem for JUUL is they want to cut out the riffraff. They want to cut out all the small companies. We want it costing $30 million to write an appropriate, application to the FDA for approval, which is due by next May. On the other hand, JUUL may have this beatific application, but based upon their adverse impact, which has been huge on the American health, they'll be taken off the market. So they're between a rock and a hard place in that way. Now, JUUL is now big tobacco. What happened? Well, they systematically followed the tobacco playbook.
We were completely surprised by the youth usage of the product, and we are taking measures now, and we'll take increasing measures to prevent that use on a going forward basis.
This is Ashley Gould, who we met, actually, and I've had a number of conversations with her. This is completely incredulous. I don't buy it one bit. So, interesting, Matt Richtel and Sheila Kaplan at the Times actually interviewed a former JUUL manager, and within a few months of JUUL's introduction, the company knew that its stuff was going to underage kids. These guys are smart. You know, the JUUL people that went to Stanford and MIT and Caltech and Harvard, they are very smart people. They're data analytic. They know where things were going. They knew it from the beginning. So I wrote this last December. It actually published on Christmas Day, which is about the hypocrisy of JUUL. And that on December 20th, Altria, maker of Marlboro, bought 35% of JUUL. Now they claim, okay, $12.8 billion, $1 billion of which was to their workforce. Why? Their workforce were a bunch of idealistic 20-year-olds who thought they were disrupting the evil tobacco industry, and then all of a sudden, uh-oh, the mask comes off. They are the tobacco industry. Now, if you remember, the JUUL founders actually sold Plume to Japan Tobacco in 2013, so it wasn't exactly a surprise to people in the know. In any event, so what does it mean? Altria says, oh, we're just investors. But 2 weeks before they announced it in early December, Altria shut down their own e-cigarette brand, Mark 10 and Green Smoke. They spent a fortune developing Mark 10 and marketing Mark 10. They also gave JUUL a 6-year non-compete. That means that Altria will not have any vaping products. What does that mean? Marlboro and Altria are one. Remember I showed you that? Part of that agreement was inserts and onserts in Marlboro packs to co-brand it. Okay? So what's happened? September 25th, they fire Ken Burns, CEO. The pressure's getting too much. Who do they appoint? The senior VP of Altria now runs JUUL. And, oh, by the way, he starts bringing in other Altria people to run regulation and other senior positions at JUUL. So this is today, from Bloomberg Business, JUUL is now big tobacco, without any question. It's now, it's very much being operated by senior tobacco executives. And I'm going to leave you with one last thought, because this is the future and it's of concern. Philip Morris was the largest company in the world for tobacco by dollar value. By volume, it's the Chinese national monopoly, but that isn't relevant. But it's split into Altria and Philip Morris International. Philip Morris International, which I'll call PMI, sells Marlboro throughout the world. Altria does it in America. Why did they do it? Because they were worried about litigation in America costing a fortune. So they wanted to insulate it off in a separate company that might have a lot of troubles with it. Now, just like Altria and JUUL have come together, Altria and its brother organization, Philip Morris, have come together. Philip Morris has the right to market Altria JUUL's vapor products around the world. And Altria has exclusive right to a new product called IQOS. What we did last summer was study JUUL. This past summer, we studied IQOS. IQOS launched in the US market 10 days ago. Okay? So what's going on is the globalization of JUUL and the Americanization of IQOS. It's called heat not burn technology. You are going to hear a ton about it coming up. It has a blade that goes into tobacco. The tobacco shredded leaf smolders, and it has actually combustion products. So it's actually smoke. It also is soaked with glycerin, so it's also vapor. I could have said some not a good word when I saw on CNN they're having a puff piece about IQOS a few days ago that said the non-smoke, non-vapor alternative IQOS comes on the market. It's in fact a hybrid product that's both smoke and vapor, not neither. But they're trying to position themselves as neither tobacco, smoke, nor vapor. That's what they're trying to do. It just launched in Atlanta. It's in 47 markets around the world. And the whole notion is to go from JUUL to IQOS to combustible cigarettes. And possibly they want people to go from cigarettes over to IQOS, especially people who smoke brands other than Marlboro and ones owned by Philip Morris. So what I think is the concern is that this company is attempting to control, these three companies with all these fraternal agreements, is trying to control the world of the three leading kinds of brands. Combustible cigarettes, Marlboro worldwide. IQOS, Heat Not Burn worldwide. JUUL, vaping worldwide. All into one big conglomerate that's going to reclaim the declining tobacco market and reclaim lapsed smokers and recruit new smokers. And it's of great concern, and we're trying to get the attention of regulators and legislators to this. We have now a 190-page description of IQOS marketing around the world. And everything I said about social media and influencers and these things was exactly the same for IQOS. And it's just launched in America, and we're going to hear a lot about it, and you may see patients with it upcoming. I think it would be helpful to summarize what we have covered today. Since their introduction over a decade ago, e-cigarettes have been essentially unregulated in America. It's a circumstance that enabled startup companies to sell their nicotine products free from the many limitations currently placed on traditional tobacco brands. Unshackled by regulation, JUUL was able to become a fad amongst American teens. The company claims that it never intended JUUL for non-smoking teens. Nevertheless, the evidence is abundantly clear that JUUL's claims to have had no hand in the youth epidemic are not credible. Quite to the contrary, as their sales volumes rose meteorically, they persevered with their youth-oriented marketing practices. Only when under the most intense regulatory scrutiny did they begrudgingly take some half measures. Now, contrary to what the leaders have claimed, the company was not ill-informed and naive about the practices of the tobacco industry. Rather, their product design, their advertising were based upon detailed study of the tobacco industry practices and hewed very closely to the tobacco traditional playbook. Even though the company knew in its early months on the market that JUUL was becoming popular amongst underage teens, it continued to push its sweet and fruity flavors via social media channels that were frequented by youth, and they sold exceptionally high nicotine concentrations, which were potently addictive to these nicotine-naive youth. Now, as we enter the end of 2019, JUUL's hypocrisy continues. JUUL claims that it sells no flavors in stores, but that is not true. Its mint and menthol remain on retail shelves, and they have soared amongst youth. JUUL has stridently opposed flavor bans, even though it's widely accepted that these are crucial to curtailing youth use. JUUL commissions junk science by appliance scientists willing to produce dubious data, which it uses for public relations and regulatory defense purposes. JUUL lobbies aggressively at multiple levels of government to oppose effective, protective legislation. It is not a sound public policy to reward a company whose leadership and investors have reaped enormous financial gains by addicting millions of children to allow it to continue on the market. Regardless of how much the company claims to have changed its ways, the FDA would be well justified were it to take JUUL off the market. It would hold them accountable for the serious harm they have inflicted upon the youth of America.